Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and this is part 2 of our exploration of Asian horror films released during 2009. Now thankfully we have already completed our coverage of all of the stink bombs from this particular year, at least in my opinion. But still, every year has a small handful of films that barely make the cut. The ones that are just kind of watchable. And 2009 does have a few of those, but we will soon leap into the legitimately good stuff very soon. And as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. Now our first film tonight is a little bit of a genre bender here. A bit of a genre bender from Japan. And it is called Blood. Or as the Japanese say, Buraddo. A Japanese horror drama action film. Now this is not to be confused with Blood the Last Vampire, which is completely different and was actually released during the same year. But in this one, it's a little bit better than that film, I would say, thankfully. A detective investigates a cold case murder, but becomes embroiled in a vampire feud. He travels to a mansion of a beautiful but reclusive woman to investigate the murder of a maid at one of her previous homes. Most conveniently, the woman informs the detective that she knows who committed the crime, thus setting into motion a blood-sucking conflict. Now, if you're one of those people who likes drama, sex, blood, and a bit of wire-fu in your vampire movies, then you might want to check this one out. It isn't as hokey as you might expect, due to the, modest pacing, pretty good acting, and effective production values. The mansion, for example, is a highlight of sorts. There are 3 brief but moderately effective fight scenes that are added into the mix. And Aya Sugimoto, who previously appeared in the Flower and Snake films from the mid-2000s, plays a good temptress. It's a role that's right in her wheelhouse, so to speak. The storyline is a bit cliched, but it does a pretty good job of taking the vampire mythos and infusing it into contemporary times. The runtime of under 1.5 hours also helps the pacing out. So I found this to be, a fairly entertaining film, but I seem to be in the minority because most reviews online are quite negative. Now, Blood, in terms of availability, I found a lower grade version on YouTube without subtitles. It's one of those videos where the picture's smaller than the YouTube, aspect ratio. The picture's a portion of it. So it's, the picture's a little bit on the small side, but it's a decent quality if you want to check it out. Haven't been able to find it on DVD too much, though, which is kind of surprising. Alright, our next film tonight. Let's see here. Is a film from Thailand. Alright. And this one is called My Ex. So, Ken is a hot young superstar and the dream date of every girl, while he can attract any woman he wants. Every detail of his life ends up in gossip columns and tabloid magazines. His 2 previous girlfriends have already been exposed to the media. So after dumping one of them, he is now dating a hot actress named Ploy, and their every move is headline news. So, this news leaks to the public, and, they find out that these 2 are going to get married at some point, so the media goes into a frenzy, and everything kind of turns inconvenient for them. So, someone starts stalking them day and night. But is it an ex-girlfriend, an obsessed fan, or a vengeful paparazzi? So Ken's agent encourages his client to take a break at a beach house at a resort, but the problem only escalates when people around Ken start to disappear, one at a time. It's a pretty basic, cliched premise here, right? The first half of this is pretty basic stuff. Uses some cheap jump scares here or there. But the second half I thought was a bit more subdued and has a few nice twists and bloody moments. Like many Thai horror films, there are plenty of scare tactics that are peppered throughout, so, it keeps moving along. There aren't too many long stretches of time where you're just sitting there waiting for something to happen, A fairly entertaining popcorn film, I think, that does not offer anything new, but I think it's sufficiently executed. I actually think the sequel is better and more entertaining, and we will cover the sequel in a future year in this playlist. So my ex, I cautiously recommend it. And that is, it is available on YouTube, but without subtitles. Some of the DVD availability of the films tonight are pretty scant. Just giving you the heads up now. Alright, our next film is basically like a two-parter. It's a two-part film. And we actually have two-part films tonight, which is quite odd. But this one, we stay in Thailand. And this is Bupa Rahtree 3.1 and 3.2. Rahtree Reborn and Rahtree Revenge. Both were released in 2009. This is a Thai horror comedy. Now, don't let the odd numbering system fool you here. We previously covered the first two films in this franchise in this playlist. Rahtree Flower of the Night from 2003 and Rahtree Returns from 2005. Check out my reviews of those films to get an idea of the type of plot you should expect. The third and fourth films in this series are almost like a reboot of sorts of this franchise, with the only remaining remnant from the first two films being the titular character, played by the same actress, which also causes some confusion, given that this is kind of a soft reboot. Even the boyfriend ghost, which was so important in the previous films, is gone, apparently having moved on in the afterlife or something. However, we do have an important character that has been added to this, a grammar school girl ghost who was abused by her stepfather and now wields a straight razor. And this ghost looks pretty nasty, I think, with a gaping mouth and a nasty attitude. So that's a positive contribution, I guess. Now, stylistically, this two-part movie is more serious than its predecessors and relies less on jump scares, which is a positive attribute. Some of the previous films in this franchise used jump scares as like a comedic aspect, which I guess I would prefer, other than jump scares actually meaning to scare you. But this one uses less of them overall, so I like that. There is also more of a mean-spirited tone during some of the horror scenes in these two films, which gives it a little bit more of an edge, I think. One particular sequence represents the most shocking of the entire franchise and involves a sadistic act of revenge on the part of the child spirit. There are a few oddball scenes as well, though. There is a little bit of humor here in the form of some oddball scenes, like the character with his eyeballs almost like popping out of his skull. Quite an odd character. Not especially funny, but I guess grin-worthy, I guess I would call it. There are also some amusing references to Chinese and Indonesian spirits in the form of a hopping vampire and a pokong. So, there's some references there to some other cultures, which I thought was kind of cool. Some of the humor doesn't always work well, and the overall story is not particularly impressive, but this two-part movie has enough good stuff, I think, to warrant a viewing, especially if you're, a fan of the franchise. So, Bupa Rahtree, Rahtree Reborn, and Rahtree Revenge. These films are available on Amazon Instant Streaming, actually, with subtitles. So I was kind of surprised to see that. These are actually quite obscure, these films. Alright, so now we're getting into kind of another step above here. We covered a few that were just watchable. Now I think we're getting into films that are, like, legitimately pretty good. And the first one is one that actually grew on me after a second viewing. And that is Missing, a South Korean horror film. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that there is an important event that occurs near the midpoint of this movie. But I'm not going to tell you exactly what it is, because I think the film would be more enjoyable if you don't know. And what I will tell you is that a beautiful young woman takes an uneventful vacation to a countryside village, but tangles with a depraved psycho who enjoys torturing people, of course. Now, this is no doubt modeled after the American vacation torture films like Hostel, Shuttle, etc. during the mid-2000s. And it does suffer from some of the same flaws. The characters make a few boneheaded moves, the cops are complete morons. However, there are more than enough positives to compensate here, I think. To start, all of the performances are good. They're very good. None of the characters are obnoxious or annoying, which I it's very important for me personally. The protagonists are likable, and even the villain is menacing, while at the same time safely avoiding like an over-the-top, irritating performance. There's also some good suspense and some wickedness throughout, and a somewhat unexpected moment, as I said, around the midpoint. At least it caught me by surprise. I don't know. And that added a little bit of interest. So, Missing, a pretty basic film with this premise you've seen before, but, this South Korea really doesn't do a premise like this that much in their horror films, They might do something like this in like a thriller, but for a straight-up American-style horror film that's probably a little bit better than some of the popular American ones from the mid-2000s, check out Missing. It's pretty good. Missing is available on YouTube with subtitles, so you're in luck there. Alright. Our next film here is another two-part film. Yes, another two-parter. And this one is from Japan, and it is called Teke Teke 1 and 2. Both released in 2009. Now, the following info I'm quoting directly from Wikipedia here. The Teke Teke, is also known as Teke Teke, is a Japanese urban legend about the ghost of a young woman or schoolgirl who fell on a railway line and was cut in half by an oncoming train. Now a vengeful spirit, or onryo, she travels on either her hands or her elbows, which is quite odd, dragging her upper torso while making a scratching or teke teke sound. If she encounters anyone at night and the victim is not fast enough, she'll slice them in half at the torso, mimicking her own disfigurement. So this was directed by our good friend Koji Shiraishi. I'm a big fan of his, as you know already, who previously directed another horror film, Carved, from 2007, that is based on a different Japanese urban legend. Now, called the Slit-Mouthed Woman, I should say. And we will see that this director is only getting started in his Japanese urban legend theme in his films, because we are going to cover a number of such films from him, a lot of which are pretty interesting. But at least this director seems to be making movies that interest him and are a bit different from genre trends. Now, there are some flaws to Teke Teke. It has a low production value and is rather slow-paced at times. The death scenes are also a little bit repetitive, but are still very different from other vengeful ghost films. I mean, you don't see Sadako or Kayako ripping people in half, you know what I mean? So it's a little different. Plus, the way this particular monster spirit moves is pretty interesting. It's almost like a human spider crawling after the victims, which I thought was pretty fun. The lighting and the atmosphere are pretty creepy at times, I thought. The investigation type stuff is conventional, but I actually think the second film in this series has more death scenes and is a little bit more entertaining than the first part. And if I remember correctly, each of these films is very manageable in their run times. I think they're both under 70 minutes each. So it's not too much of a time investment on your hands. And I know some people like these films more than I do. So Teke Teke, I recommend. Now, unfortunately, I don't think it's gotten a US release on DVD, but it's also available on YouTube with subtitles. Alright, and we stick with Japan with the next one, with a film that is a bit controversial. It's a little bit controversial. And that is Grotesque. Now, this is again directed by our good friend Koji Shiraishi. This time, however, it is not a found footage film a la Noroi, or a film about Japanese urban legends. No. This one focuses instead on torture and violence, which is a little bit of a theme in this video, isn't it? So, an unnamed doctor has always had everything he's ever wanted, but that has only made him develop more extreme and depraved needs. He kidnaps a young couple in the prime of their life and forces them into a game of torment that slowly extinguishes their hopes for survival. So in my opinion, this is actually a little bit better than the usual torture flick that you'd see. The interesting thing about this one is that it focuses quite a bit on psychological torture, which implicitly complements the protagonist's physical torments at all times, but also is allowed to come to, the forefront at times. The psychological stuff comes to the forefront during a few scenes. And there's one particularly good exchange of dialogue as well near the end of the movie, which is something you rarely see in films of this kind. Now, quite obviously, there is some good gore and sufficient depravity on display for the gore hounds out there, so you'll like it for that. With a handful of wince-worthy, cringe-inducing acts of violence. The first half is kind of by-the-book torture, but I thought the second half has a few unexpected developments, which also include a silly but blackly humorous moment that may rub some viewers the wrong way. This one catches you by surprise, if good or bad, for you to decide. Either way, it's certainly unconventional at certain points, which I admired. The actor who plays the bad guy, his name is Shigeo Osako, is a very effective bad guy, and he would later star as the lead protagonist in a handful of this director's other films. So Grotesque, if you want a gory film, I think it comes pretty strong with the goods in that regard, but it also has some interesting stuff to it. Like I said, some of the blackly humorous stuff near the end seems to come from out of nowhere, but because it's kind of odd and different, it rubbed me the right way. So I recommend Grotesque. Now, Grotesque is available on widely available on DVD. So it's the most widely available film, I think, in this particular video. It's worth checking out if you're into that kind of thing. All right, so we have 2 left for tonight. This one is pretty rare. Okay, our next one here, this one's pretty rare. I got it. I can't remember if I actually bought it while I was in Japan. I may have. And it is called Shin Mimibukuro, Scream. Again, this Japanese horror film. And this is one of those blind buy DVDs that, didn't have subtitles. No subtitles here for me to rely on. And there's really no coverage of this film anywhere on the internet. It's so obscure. But I'm going to go off of the pure visuals in explaining the story, basically from what I watched. So this fairly short film, actually, concerns some schoolgirls who discover a haunted painting that may be connected to a series of deaths at their school. So the theme feels almost like a blend of the traditional Onryo ghost with the slit-mouthed woman legend, kind of a combination between the two. The ghost kind of approaches its victims and shows her face to them, which coerces them to commit suicide by hanging. That's kind of an interesting premise. A creepy mood and some cool shots of hanging bodies overcomes any cliches that might be present here. For a low-budget movie, I thought that the direction, the scoring, and the acting were actually pretty good in this. It takes itself seriously, and it mostly succeeds at being, rather eerie at times. It's only 40 minutes long, so there's really not a whole lot more to say about this one, but I do recommend this if you have the means. Shin Mimibukuro Scream. And don't get that confused with other Shin Mimibukuro films. There's like a ton of them. This is the Scream version. So I recommend it. This film is only available on Region 2 DVD without subtitles, unfortunately. Alright, our last film tonight. Arguably the best film of the night, although it's probably a toss-up. We've had... we've seen some films in the last few videos, like Invitation Only from the last video, which drew influence from mainstream American horror films from the mid-2000s. And, Missing seemed to do the same thing. This one seems to be an homage to The Untold Story, the Hong Kong film from the early 90s. And this is called Meat Grinder from Thailand. Now, this one is about a disturbed woman who hears voices in her head and is tormented by visions, having been taught some pretty dubious and unconventional food preparation and cooking skills by her mother. She decides to open up a noodle stall, using the body of a man left over from a riot as the main ingredient. Soon enough, the customers are turning up in droves for her delicious meals, and life is starting to look good after a nice young man takes an interest in her. However, her past comes back to haunt her, and as her mental state breaks down, yet more people end up on the chopping block or hanging up on meat hooks in her basement. So this premise, again, it will remind you of the Hong Kong film, The Untold Story, excuse me, which we looked at while covering 1993 in this playlist. Now, it does have some similarities, but the dramatic elements and character development serve a much different purpose in Meat Grinder. I would not necessarily say that the viewer will be sympathetic towards this main character, but there's definitely an element that attributes part of her mental problem with her surrounding environment, and so that kind of humanizes her a little bit more. You know what I mean? It does humanize her a little bit. For horror fans out there, there is adequate violence and blood, but it's not nearly as pronounced as something like, Art of the Devil 2 or The Untold Story. But it is there. The death scenes are quite numerous, actually. The pacing is rather brisk, and the acting is pretty good. So again, it's a lot like some of these other films tonight. Stuff like Missing or Grotesque. It has a certain quality about it, despite being similar to films from other countries. So I do recommend Meat Grinder. It's good. It is available on Region 3 DVD with subtitles. I've also seen an all-region DVD floating around on eBay. Alright, so that's it tonight. Ran through that Part 2 quite well, I think. And be sure to join me for Part 3, where we will continue to cover some of the more interesting Asian horror films from this particular year. And as always, we'll see you next time.